Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's public lecture organized by the Institute for Mathematical Sciences at the National University of Singapore. I'm Alex Thierry, the Deputy Director of the IMS. Our public lecture series is generously supported by the Eng Kong Beng Memorial Fund. The IMS is very grateful and would like to thank the Eng Kong Beng Fund. This evening, I'm very pleased that we have Professor Tyler VanderWeele from Harvard University delivering the public lecture. Now, my colleague, Professor Li Jialiang, will introduce the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Eng Kong Beng public lecture series. My name is Li Jialiang. I'm from National University of Singapore, and I'm one of the local organizers of this workshop on causal inference. And I will also be chairing this public lecture. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Tyler VanderWeele to give a talk on human flourishing and causal inference. Before Professor VanderWeele starts his talk, let me give a brief introduction. Okay, Professor VanderWeele is a John L. Loeb and Francis Neyman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is also the director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University. His research has focused on the application of causal inference to epidemiology, as well as on the relationship between religion and health. He is a recipient of the 2017 President's Award from the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies, COPS Award. Okay, has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and he also writes a monthly blog, posting on topics related to human flourishing or psychological today. So now, Professor VanderWeele, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be with you all here this evening in Singapore, morning here in Boston. But I'm delighted that I'll be able to speak today on human flourishing and the causal inference. At Harvard, I sort of have two hats that I wear. One is as a methodologist, a statistician, an epidemiologist working on the development of methodology for causal inference. But a lot of my empirical work is focused on the topic of well-being or human flourishing, and trying to increase the level of methodological rigor that is used when we study topics of well-being, trying to employ better causal inference methods to tackle these problems. And so in today's public lecture, I'm going to try to interweave the two topics together. While my focus will be human flourishing, since this is a general open public lecture and I want to keep the content accessible, I will be making remarks on the importance of causal inference for studying human flourishing. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about what human flourishing is, how are we to understand this concept, and how do we try to go about measuring it. I'll then make some remarks on a number of randomized trials that have been carried out, sort of often considered the gold standard for drawing causal inferences, concerning activities to promote flourishing and what we might learn from them and how we might use them to try to promote flourishing at the individual and even population levels. I'll then talk about other pathways to flourishing through communities and institutions, which we really cannot easily study with randomized trials. We need to rely on observational studies, which makes causal inference more challenging. And so we really do need to draw upon principles of causal inference if we're trying to draw causal conclusions about what pathways truly causally contribute to human flourishing. So I'll go through there a literature review, trying to apply somewhat more stringent criteria for observational studies of causal inference than is typically done in the well-being literature. And I'll make some concluding remarks on where I see this work going. More information on the flourishing framework I'll be employing here can be found in this 2017 paper on the promotion of human flourishing. And some of the evidence from randomized trials can be found in this 2020 paper on activities for flourishing, an evidence-based guide. The observational study literature review is in the 2017 paper, and more information on the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, which I direct, can be found on our website. So what is flourishing? Well, many of our institutions and academic disciplines often aspire to very grand visions of flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as the study of how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of the agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology is sometimes described as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, many of our discussions, many of our studies are often restricted to specific disease states or simple measures of feeling happy or to income, say. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's the word often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. But the working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing Program is that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, very all-encompassing, very general. This is arguably what we're after, what we hope for as individuals, and I think really should be seeking as a society. I think the discipline that's come closest to trying to empirically capture this is that of positive psychology, and many conceptualizations and measures of psychological well-being have been put forward in the literature. But notably absent from pretty much all of these is any notion of physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're bedridden or physically ill? Often missing from these measures are sort of any notion of character or virtue, contrary to Plato, Aristotle, the majority of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical, cultural, religious traditions worldwide. But with an understanding so broad, we might wonder, well, can we ever really measure this? And can we ever achieve consensus? And surely the understanding of what we really mean by flourishing is going to differ across individuals and cultures and religious and philosophical traditions. And while I think it is the case that understandings of flourishing will vary, I think we can try to begin to focus at least on what's common to many of these traditions. And so what I would argue is that kind of any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but any reasonable conception would include these 5 as well, whatever else they might include. So these 5 are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these things exhaust flourishing, but each is a part of it. I think each of these domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this as well now. And each is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake, not merely as a means to some other end. And I think these 2 criteria, being universally desired and being an end, could help shape consensus around what to measure. So as a brief, crude assessment of flourishing, which we're trying to now use in empirical research, we've developed a short index, essentially taking 2 questions from each of those 5 domains, questions chosen principally from the existing well-being literature, questions that have received some degree of empirical validation, that already have widespread use. The only domain where we introduced 2 new questions was the character domain, where although there's been a lot of work on assessment of individual character traits like fortitude or humility. There's been very little that's been done globally, so we worked with philosophers to try to develop 2 questions on character. So these are the 10 questions we've been using in the empirical work we've been doing. First, in the life satisfaction and happiness domain, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Scored self-report 0, completely dissatisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. And this is perhaps the most widely used well-being question in the literature. It's used by the OECD, by the UK's annual survey. It's been used by Gallup and cohort studies. It'll be used next year in the United States as well in the National Health Interview Survey. So a widely used question, but we then supplement that with something more effective on feeling happy, and generally how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? 0, extremely unhappy, 10, extremely happy. The second domain, physical and mental health. First question in general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 to 10. How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10. And these questions are likewise widely used. The mental health question comes from the World Health Organization's mental health survey. The other one's used in the US General Social Survey for physical health. So standard questions. Third domain, meaning and purpose. First, overall, to what extent you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile. Again, 0 to 10. This question is also very widely used. OECD, UK's annual survey, many cohort studies. Then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. 0, completely disagree. 10, completely agree. The fourth domain is character and virtue. First question intended in some crude way to try to assess practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, completely untrue of me, to 10, completely true of me. And second question intended in some crude way to try to assess fortitude and moderation. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. And the fifth domain, close social relationships. I am content with my friendships and relationships, essentially trying to capture the extent or quantity of those relationships. And both these questions were drawn from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of brief loneliness and social connectedness instruments. And then that's supplemented with the second one, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be. Again, scored 0 to 10. This one's kind of trying to capture the quality of those relationships. So as a crude index, we sometimes average these 10 questions for an overall composite score, but most of the research we're doing, we look at the domains separately, because as you'll see, the dynamics can be quite different across these various domains. So really the average of the composite should be understood as nothing more than the average of just the 5 more meaningful domains. We do sometimes supplement these questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. So we've taken 2 questions drawn from the financial well-being literature. How often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0 to 10. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? And so sometimes we'll take an average of all 12 questions for a secure flourishing index, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, because financial resources really are means, not ends, but arguably more satisfactory in practice, indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. So I think these sorts of questions can be useful for self-reflection. I'll go through them myself, maybe once a quarter or so, to figure out what's going on, what's going well, where am I struggling? How are things changing? So it can be useful for identifying areas of improvement, changes one wants to make in life, or tracking how things are going over time. So when we've used these now in sort of workplace and school and sort of national contexts and medical settings. And some of the feedback we've received, say in the workplace setting, has been as follows. Some of the questions made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on, or relief. Someone is asking, I want help in certain areas, or slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose, or missing a greater purpose, need to reach out and help more and give back. One respondent commented that after going through the 10 questions, she decided, after it had been months that she really was going to commit to a volunteering activity. So in some ways, the assessment itself almost serves as an intervention. So I'll go on in this talk to discuss more research uses of this assessment and how we try to study flourishing using principles of causal inference. But again, I think the assessment itself can in fact be helpful in thinking about life. And so I realize this is a little strange, perhaps especially on Zoom, but I'm going to go back to those 10 questions and then just give everyone maybe 90 seconds to ponder them with regard to their own life. Just go through the 10, give yourself a self-assessment. Won't be collecting any data here, but just as an opportunity for self-reflection, we'll just take 90 seconds or so for you to go through these 10 questions, and then I'll pick things up and we'll talk more about kind of research uses of this. But I'll stay silent for just a little bit of time now. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think a little bit about these questions, reflect on your own life, and so again, I think it's helpful with regard to understanding one's life, what's going well, what's not, changes one might want to make. But I think this can also be done, in fact, at community levels or even national levels. So I'm going to present some data now on how these questions have played out in the United States during the pandemic. So we collected data on these questions in roughly nationally representative samples in the United States in January of 2020, before the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then again 6 months later in the midst of the pandemic in June of 2020. And interestingly, in January of 2020, the average score in most of these domains really was about 7, some a little higher, some slightly lower, but really pretty much 7 across the different dimensions, except for financial and material stability, where it was about 6. And we've observed these patterns with other data as well. Often, not always, but often the financial and material stability domain is lowest. It's not the case, for example, in Germany or in some of our workplace samples, but in many cases it is. Unsurprisingly, well-being went down during the COVID-19 pandemic, but interestingly, different domains were affected in different ways. So, happiness and life satisfaction, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, declined quite a bit, 0.7 of a point. Mental and physical health likewise declined, unsurprisingly, 0.7 of a point. The largest fall was in financial and material stability, nearly a full point. On this scale. And again, the June 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States during the pandemic, and lots of job insecurity as well. So again, cause for concern, but perhaps not surprising. But interestingly, some of the other domains were not as strongly affected. A much smaller decline in meaning and purpose. The character assessments were pretty much level during this time. And somewhat surprisingly, the social relationships domain went down a little bit, but not very much, 0.2 of a point. And this has in fact been corroborated by other studies. Loneliness increased a little bit, but not all that much. Somewhat surprisingly, people have found ways to connect during that pandemic, either investing perhaps more closely in family or those they're living with, or connecting via Zoom. So yeah, some falls, but not that substantial. So this sort of data can help understand, how things are changing as well, and what areas need to be addressed. Importantly, these averages, of course, do disguise heterogeneity. Interestingly, the standard deviation in all of these domains went up during the pandemic. So while for some people the pandemic may have even allowed them to invest more deeply in their relationships and family life, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this was probably a very difficult time. So we need to look at not just the means, but also the entire distribution. But again, this gives some sense as to how these sorts of data collection efforts can be useful, even I think at national levels. So I want to move now towards approaches to improve flourishing, and the use of ideas from causal inference to study the principal causes of human flourishing. And a discipline that really has made, I think, important contributions in this regard is positive psychology. There have been many positive psychology interventions that have been developed, and many of these have been tested in randomized trials, in some cases even dozens of randomized trials with meta-analyses of these randomized trials to examine how these different types of activities promote human flourishing. And so again, randomized trials, when carried out well, with little attrition, little loss to follow-up, really are the gold standard for establishing causal inference. And so these trials have been used to study these positive psychological interventions. Some examples of some of the effective ones include gratitude interventions. This has been studied in dozens and dozens of randomized trials. And these are designed along the following lines. We randomize people to either 3 times a week write down 3 things you're grateful for and why, or alternatively just write about some neutral event in life. And in these randomized trials, those who are randomized to gratitude rather than the neutral writing activity are found, even 6 months later, to have lower depressive symptoms, higher levels of happiness, better self-reported sleep, better self-reported health symptoms. And again, there have been dozens of these trials. This is perhaps the best studied of these positive psychology interventions. We practice this in my family as well, and I think it really does make a difference. Another sort of set of interventions are acts of kindness interventions. These are something along the lines of for 6 weeks. Choose 1 day a week to carry out 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to try to get 5 in a single day, but these have likewise been found to improve levels of happiness, improve engagement and sense of flow in life, and in a number of randomized trials. Yet another one is identify your kind of top 5 character strengths, and there are different assessments to do this, and try to use them. Each of them in a new way once a week, and likewise effects even 6 months later on improving happiness, reducing depressive symptoms. There's other work done, kind of easy to implement, do-it-yourself interventions on addressing psychological distress. Some of these are workbooks, for example. Feeling Good for depressive symptoms has been studied, I think, in at least 5 different randomized trials, and have found to relieve depressive symptoms. Another workbook, Mastery of Your Anxiety and Panic, has been examined in 1 small randomized trial. I think really more work needs to be done on anxiety with regard to workbook interventions, but effects similar to using the workbook along with meeting with a therapist. We've been working on forgiveness workbook interventions to help those who want to forgive and are having trouble doing so, who are having trouble getting over their anger. And this has been examined in some randomized trials, some evidence for relieving depression and anxiety and improving hope. We're right now running a very large randomized trial in 5 countries, Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong, to look at whether these sorts of simple workbook interventions, which you can find on, say, Everett Worthington's website, might be helpful in sort of international contexts to promote forgiveness, but also address questions of mental health. So, more information on this and on the evidence. The evidence is not equal across these different interventions. Again, well established for gratitude, but more work needed on, say, anxiety, and we'll hopefully soon have definitive results out on forgiveness. But more information on the randomized trial evidence and some observational evidence can be found in this 2020 paper on activities for human flourishing. We also now have a flourishing app, which you can download from our website, that implements some of these activities. Interestingly, if we think about these interventions and the flourishing domains that I described earlier, most of these interventions have had effects on either happiness or health, the first two domains, and the effects of the other flourishing domains on purpose, on character, on relationships are somewhat less clear. The interventions that have been designed to try to increase purpose in life, many of these have failed. In fact, the randomized trials just haven't been successful. No effect, or at least no long-term effect. It fades after a few weeks. And I really think the evidence to date suggests that to change these other domains of flourishing, purpose, character, relationships, just kind of simple one-off do-it-yourself interventions aren't sufficient. We need something more. We need communities, we need involvement in institutions, we need longer-term relationships. And so I'll now go on to describe some of the evidence, now observational study evidence, that I think points to this conclusion. And I'll essentially be doing this through a kind of a public health lens. We often think of the public health impact of an exposure or a phenomena as a function of two things. First, the prevalence of the exposure or phenomena, how common it is. And then secondly, the size of its effects. Something that's common in the population that has large effects on the outcomes that we care about is going to shape population health. So if we apply that sort of lens to physical health, we're led to things like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, getting enough sleep. But if we broaden the scope of the outcomes we're looking at, if we look at not just physical health, but flourishing more broadly, and ask what is both common and has large effects on not just physical health, but all the flourishing domains, the list ends up looking rather different, I would say. So again, if we ask what's common and what has large effects, not just on physical health, but also on happiness and meaning and character and close relationships, we're led to a different set of factors. And so based on a review of the literature, which I'll describe shortly, trying to apply principles of causal inference, I would propose 4 pathways to human flourishing. 4 institutional or community pathways to human flourishing. These are family, work, education, and religious community. I think there's good evidence that each of these is relatively common in the population and has large effects from rigorous longitudinal studies using principles of causal inference on the various flourishing domains. So the argument here is not that these 4 are exhaustive. I think there are, for certain individuals, other pathways that can have important effects on flourishing. Maybe engagement with the arts, say, is really important to the lives of some people and helps them flourish. But perhaps that sort of serious engagement in the arts is less common in the population. So, but the argument's not that these are exhaustive. The argument's also not that these 4 are necessary. One can flourish even in the absence of one or more of these pathways. But the argument's rather that each of these powerfully affects the various domains of flourishing and is common in the population, so that if individual and policy efforts were made to kind of enhance these pathways, that population flourishing would increase. So this conclusion was drawn from a review of the existing well-being literature, and but really trying to restrict to the most rigorous studies, using principles of causal inference, trying to restrict to longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs. So cross-sectional designs where all the data was collected at the same time, which is the vast majority of well-being studies. All of these were excluded because these are pretty much worthless. Cross-sectional studies are pretty much worthless for trying to establish causality. And that's because from cross-sectional data, we can't work out the direction of causal effects. As some examples, we've known for a long time that marriage and happiness are correlated. But is that because marriage causes happiness? Or is that because happy people are more likely to go on to subsequently get married? There is, in fact, I think, evidence for both, but from cross-sectional data, we can't tell. Likewise, there's evidence that religious service attendance is associated with lower depressive symptoms. But is that because religious service attendance really protects against depression? or because those who become depressed withdraw from their religious communities and other forms of community life as well. Again, from cross-sectional data, we can't tell. We need longitudinal data over time to try to provide evidence for causality. So I've written a piece in JAMA Psychiatry that recently came out earlier this year on it's a simple, short 2-page piece on kind of intuitive principles for causal inference, trying to distill the more technical work, which has been extremely important over the last several decades on causal inference, into a brief summary of how do we go about evaluating this evidence in practice. And so ideally, I think we want longitudinal data where we're controlling for the baseline outcome to try to begin to rule out reverse causation. We want to control for a rich set of potential confounders as well, but because the data is observational, we never know whether there might be some third factor that's confounding our effect. So I think we also want to examine whether our associations, even controlling for those confounders and controlling for the baseline outcome, are also robust to potential unmeasured confounding. We want to use sensitivity analysis to do this. And in the next slide, I'll make a few remarks on one simple way to carry out such sensitivity analysis for unmeasured confounding. But I think it's really important to examine robustness of associations in these observational studies when we're trying to assess causality. Ideally, we hope that the evidence comes from multiple sources, multiple studies. Ideally, we want a meta-analysis of observational studies and trials that control for baseline outcome and to look at the distribution of those effect sizes. And I think much more work needs to be done on restricting meta-analyses to longitudinal studies, on throwing out all cross-sectional studies when carrying out meta-analyses on these topics. So these are just a few of the principles I think are important and that were applied in this literature review. And in some cases, this involved essentially throwing out the vast majority of the studies on the topic because they were cross-sectional. So as one example, although there have been over 100 studies on religious involvement and happiness and life satisfaction, at the time of this literature review, and things have improved somewhat since then, but at the time of this literature review, all but one of these studies were cross-sectional and were excluded from this review because, again, we can't draw causal inferences from cross-sectional data. So I'm going to make a few more remarks on the importance of sensitivity analysis for causal inference, and then I'll kind of go on to review the evidence itself. So the sensitivity analysis, the idea is we look at our associations, we try to control for confounders and ideally baseline outcome, but then we also ask how robust are associations to a potentially unmeasured factor that might confound our associations. And there's been work for decades and decades on how to do this. There are a whole host of techniques. They haven't been used all that often in practice. And I think some of that's because, for clinical or social science researchers, they often become quite technical and difficult to implement and interpret. So in 2017, I introduced a new measure to do this very easily called the E-value. It was published in this paper in 2017 here in the Annals of Internal Medicine, but it's become quite popular, I think, because of its simplicity. And basically, with this technique, you just have U denote a set of unmeasured confounders. It involves only two parameters, one of which is RRUY, which is essentially the maximum effect that U could have comparing any two categories on the outcome Y, conditional on the measured covariates C and the exposure or treatment A. So this is just kind of the maximum effect of U on the outcome Y. And the other parameter, RRAU, is the maximum risk ratio relating any two categories of U to the exposure A, conditional on the covariates. And one can show that the mathematics is a bit complex to prove it, but the result itself is very simple, very easy to use. One can show that if both of those sensitivity parameters are greater than this quantity here, where RR is the observed risk ratio relating the exposure and the outcome conditional on the covariate. So you fit a logistic regression, say, or a log binomial model to get a risk ratio. You plug it into this formula, risk ratio plus the observed risk ratio plus the square root of the observed risk ratio times the risk ratio minus 1. If both of the parameters are greater than this quantity here, then that amount of confounding could suffice, but weaker confounding associations could not. And we're calling this quantity here the E value. And it provides a simple way to try to assess robustness to unmeasured confounding. If you had an observed risk ratio of 2 and plugged it into this formula, you'd get an E value of 3.4, which would mean the association between the unmeasured confounder and the outcome and the exposure, if both of those were 3.4 or higher, that could suffice, but weaker joint confounder associations could not. And so it gives one a sense of the robustness or sensitivity of one's results to potential unmeasured confounding. And because of its simplicity and ease of interpretation, it has become quite popular since its introduction in 2017. I think it's now been cited in over 1,500 papers, over 700 in 2021 alone. And I don't think it's necessarily a superior technique to the others out there. It's just easier to use, easier to interpret, easier to kind of pass on to clinical or social science colleagues. So we've also done implementations in R and in Stata and for other scales. We have an online e-value calculator. But I do think looking at how robust one's conclusions are to unmeasured confounding is quite important. So in any case, when we applied these criteria on restricting to longitudinal studies with control to baseline outcome or experimental or quasi-experimental designs, and when we looked at robustness to confounding, this literature review provided evidence that these 4 pathways really do contribute to the various flourishing outcomes. The numbers here on these various arrows correspond to references to some of these more rigorous studies that provide evidence. So in some cases, the evidence is fairly robust. We're getting a number of studies, or in some cases, meta-analyses of longitudinal studies. But in other cases, more work needs to be done. There was maybe only 1 or 2 studies that met these criteria, and we probably need to do more work on examining the evidence. So this literature review was kind of the foundation for this claim that family, work, education, religious community are important pathways to flourishing. But we're also now trying to create better data sets, observational data sets, longitudinal data sets to study these topics more rigorously. So we've been collecting data on a number of workplace settings, generally longitudinal data with 2 or 3 waves of follow-up. We've done this with employees at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and China, a group of international flight attendants, and also a number of other settings as well, clinical settings, universities, various universities in the United States, secondary schools in the US, in the UK, India, and China, various communities. These measures are being embedded in a number of existing large cohort studies, including the Nurses' Health Study 1 and 2 at Harvard, LSPAC in the UK, the Japanese gerontological study will be incorporating these flourishing measures in the next wave. So I think these studies will be important resources to better study with better study designs, longitudinal data, using the principles of causal inference to better study what shapes human flourishing. Some of the patterns we've observed is that, and I commented on this earlier, but the financial domain is often ranked the lowest. Again, not always. That wasn't the case, for example, in our sample in Aetna, but it's often the case. With regard to the United States, often social connectedness is rated lower there than most of the rest of the world. So I find that living here in this country somewhat troubling, and I think we need to do more to invest. Interestingly, most of these flourishing dimensions increase with age until a fairly late age, 70s or 80s in some cases. And this is a bit in contrast to earlier work, which had suggested kind of more of a U-shaped pattern with well-being, where those younger and older were doing well, those in midlife not as well. And it seems with the more recent data that left part of the U has been flattening. Young people aren't doing as well as they used to be. So again, perhaps calls for concern and need to try to help young people. We've also observed that while happiness and life satisfaction tends to be higher in richer developed countries, measures of meaning and purpose tend to be higher in poorer developing countries than the richer developed world. So again, I think this likewise is perhaps a cause for reflection on what's going on. How do we carry out development and economic progress in a way that doesn't compromise meaning and purpose? So to try to understand these phenomena better and what shapes flourishing, we are launching a global flourishing study. We've been working the last 3 years to try to get funding for this, which is now secured, and been working with Gallup on the study design. But the data collection will be starting January. We'll be starting next month, and this study will involve a cohort of 240,000 individuals from 22 different countries with nationally representative sampling in each country, covering about half of the world's population. You can see the countries where we're doing data collection here on this map. And we'll be doing annual data collection on the same panel of these 240,000 individuals once a year for 5 years to try to, over time, understand what factors are shaping flourishing using methods, approaches, and principles from causal inference. This will be an open access data resource, so anyone will be able to access it and make use of it for any purpose that they like. And more information on the study is available on our website, but we hope that this data resource really provides an opportunity to use principles of causal inference to more rigorously study what shapes human flourishing. And I think this work does have policy implications. If we think about flourishing in a very broad context, I think it affects welfare policies. While I do think welfare is important and important to sustain people materially, I think these, given the importance of work, say, on shaping flourishing, I think we need welfare policies that don't disincentivize work, because while kind of providing people material resources and access to healthcare is important, work does more than that. Work also contributes to people's sense of purpose and provides them a context to make use of their character strengths and a context in which to develop relationships. So I think we need policies that don't disincentivize work. And there's been some important research on supportive employment programs for people who are disadvantaged and mentally ill, helping them to find work, even in competitive settings. And I think this really does promote flourishing. Likewise, given the importance of family and marriage, I think, say, online marital counseling programs could be made disseminated, made easily, widely available to try to address marital problems early on, to try to prevent divorce, which I think the literature suggests really decreases flourishing, both for the couple, but especially so for children. Education is critical. I think all students really need access to good teachers. I think systems need to be in place to replace poor teachers. Likewise, religious communities, I think, contribute a great deal to human flourishing. I think it's important that there's religious liberty, and while these communities have their own problems as well, which need to be addressed, I think both the positive and not just the negative contributions of these communities need to be highlighted in the media and academic work. I think current portrayals are quite imbalanced with regard to what the empirical research literature, in fact, suggests with regard to their contribution to human life and human flourishing. So I've given a pretty high-level overview. We're also doing some work now on community levels of well-being, on tradition-specific measures of of spiritual well-being. I'm trying to incorporate more non-Western perspectives into this work. A lot of current research has been shaped on well-being by predominantly Western conceptions. So doing work on kind of what aspects of well-being are perhaps important universally, but are given greater emphasis in non-Western cultures and need more emphasis in the literature. And so out of some of that work have come kind of notions of balance and harmony and peace, which I do think are nearly universally desired as well, but perhaps given greater emphasis in non-Western culture. So we're hoping to incorporate that as well. And then also working with specific populations, kind of end-of-life populations or adolescent contexts on flourishing. So, a few concluding remarks, and then we'll take questions. And I do think flourishing is this overarching concept pertaining to all aspects of life. I think this is important individually, but I think needs to be given greater emphasis in research and in policy. I think we should incorporate a broader set of outcomes into our studies. We do very well at studying physical health and income, but I think we need to also apply similar effort and empirical rigor with regard to meaning or relationships or character. And what I've proposed in a series of papers as we start using outcome-wide designs. I have a paper in statistical science kind of outlining causal inference principles for outcome-wide designs, where we look at not just one outcome, but a whole host of flourishing outcomes simultaneously. So I think we need rigorous designs looking at a wide range of flourishing outcomes. I think we need better research support in terms of government funding and university funding for these other outcomes like happiness, meaning, character, relationships, better methods and study designs for causal inference. A lot of the quality of the work on well-being is very, very poor. We need to bring in causal inference approaches. I think we should start tracking these flourishing outcomes at national and international levels and not just focus on GDP. GDP is important, but people care about more than money in life. They care about being happy, about having meaning, about having good relationships. I think we should start tracking these things over time. I think what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies put in place to achieve it. So I think we should be aiming for flourishing personally and as a community as well. So that concludes my talk. Thank you all for being here and listening, and happy now to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor VanderWeele, for this wonderful talk. Okay, so now it's time for question. Okay, because we have quite a lot of participants here. So if you want to raise your question, if you want to ask a question, could you please first raise your hand in the chat box, and then we'll unmute you, and then you can ask your questions to Professor. Okay. So meanwhile, Tyler, I saw some questions in the chat box during the speech. Do you want
to address these? Yeah. Okay. So first one, I guess different people may assign different weights to different dimensions. That is the case. I mean, we have data now also on how important people consider these different domains in life. So not just asking how well they're doing, but how important do you think each of these are? And if we look at averages, the answer is almost everyone thinks all of these domains are important. The average score 0 to 10 in terms of importance that we get across these domains is about 9 out of 10. And sort of fewer than 1% say the importance is 5 or less. So in terms of those giving these domains a low score, it's a small percent. But we do have data on at least some individuals who would give some domain a 0 for every domain but physical health. The lowest score we've gotten in terms of importance of physical health across the samples right now is 2. But there are individuals who say, I just don't care about this particular domain. So, I mean, in principle, one could weight according to self-assessed importance. At the individual level, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do comparisons and etiologic work, but that would be possible. But if one were to do, say, communal weighting on importance of the domains, basically what you're brought back to is equal weighting. But I do think this question of importance is interesting, and we have a couple of papers in progress on looking at importance and what predicts importance and how that varies across different populations. I think it's a good point. Another question on do we assume that risk ratio is greater than 1? What if risk ratio is less than 1? I think this was on the e-value calculation. And yeah, sorry, I did not clarify this. That calculation, that e-value calculation, is for risk ratios greater than 1. For risk ratios less than 1, the same principles apply, but you take the inverse first and apply it to the e-value calculation. The two parameters are always understood as the maximum effect on the risk ratio scale. So if you thought the unmeasured confounder reduced your outcome by twofold rather than increased it, you take the inverse first and get 2. So everything's being really interpreted as risk ratio greater than 1. If something's less than 1, you take the inverse first. There are more details in that 2017 paper, and the technical details were in a paper a year before in 2016, where you can actually see the mathematics. But yeah, I got a lot more on kind of implementation in those papers. And then let's see another one. E-value is a function of RR. It contains no more information than RR. Then what is the reason for using e-value rather than RR for causal inference? Perfectly reasonable point. It is simply a function of the risk ratio. The advantage is it puts it on the confounder association scale. An analogy I will often give is that the p-value has in many settings gives you no more information than the estimate and the confidence interval. You can derive one from the other. Most people can't do that in their head. And so it's, to my mind, useful to have both the confidence interval and the p-value, even though they don't contain any additional information. They're operating on different scales. They have different interpretation. It's helpful to see both. And so same with the e-value. It's a highly nonlinear function, especially at low values of the risk ratio. So like a risk ratio, if you have a lower confidence limit of 1.04 versus 1.12, it might not look so different in terms of evidence or the p-value, but the e-values are vastly different in those two situations. I think one, you probably want to be cautious. The other one, you've got moderate evidence once you do the e-value calculation. So it's really just an interpretive tool. It gives no further information than the risk ratio itself, but it allows you to ask, oh, do I think there's an unmeasured confounder that would really increase the outcome by twofold and decrease the likelihood of the exposure by twofold, say. But you are right. There's sort of no additional information in the e-value. It's really just an interpretative tool to convert it to an unmeasured confounding association scale. Is domestic work counted as work? How is religion defined in the survey? Yeah, so I mean, I think the domestic work question is an important one. I personally would count domestic work as important work. I mean, I think it's making an enormous contribution to society. I don't think we will have societal flourishing unless there's heavy investment in the next generation and caring for children. And I think certainly in the West, this has been, certainly in the United States, this has been under emphasized. I wouldn't say we have really good rigorous data from longitudinal studies on say childcare and its effects on flourishing. But I hope over the years to change that. So in terms of the evidence, don't know, but my guess is that this likewise will profoundly contribute to flourishing. I think there's some cross-sectional evidence, which again I'm skeptical of, but sometimes does point in the right direction. That domestic work may not have such profound effects on happiness, at least in the short term, but does on meaning and purpose. And so we may see over time that that's what plays out, but more is needed. With regard to religion, the indicator that has these profound effects on health and well-being is really religious service attendance. It's participating in a religious community. Individual private practices, I mean, I think are important and meaningful in one's life, but don't have such profound effects on health and well-being. It's that kind of communal participation in a community with a shared set of values and vision for life, which seems to have the important effects in reducing mortality risk by 30%, incidence depression by 30%, suicide by 5-fold, divorce by 50%. I mean, big effects on important outcomes, but it really is that communal participation rather than private practices that the evidence suggests has these profound effects. Given reservations about cross-cultural comparisons of the domains of flourishing, how do you envision interpretation of the global flourishing study? It's a very good question. What we're proposing in terms of the analysis is that these are treated as 22 distinct cohort studies. And so we're going to analyze them separately in all 22 countries, report the results separately in all 22 countries. We will be combining the results in a meta-analysis as well, but that's going to be interpreted as not the effect of working on purpose and happiness, but here's the distribution of the effects that we're observing across these 22 contexts. And I mean, I'm sure people will do the comparisons. Oh, this country's higher on purpose, and this one's higher on happiness, and that's already being done, say in the World Happiness report, and I'm sure it'll be done here as well. But I do think those really need to be interpreted cautiously. I mean, I know there's evidence from Japan, for example, that on the 0 to 10 scales, people will tend to score themselves more towards the middle, because the middle is seen as kind of a more reasonable place to be. And so while I think comparisons, I think you're still getting valuable information, and comparisons are reasonable within Japan. Comparing Japan to Germany or the United Kingdom, I think generally doesn't make too much sense. So we really are going to be treating these similarly, though again, meta-analyzing to also see what the distribution of these effects look like over time. But I do think it is an important caveat. Let's see, work, education, marriage, and religion appear at first glance to be rather intuitive factors that contribute to flourishing. How does this gel with the observation that more people are choosing to remain single or free thinkers? No, I think it's a really good question, and I think it also points to the need for longitudinal data. I tend to think what's going on is that when development occurs, when material circumstances are better, people often withdraw from religion, or don't feel they need to be in a family context or be married. I think that desire for freedom is real, and I think the effects on societal flourishing and on their own individual flourishing are in fact negative. I think they've prioritized freedom, but at the cost of withdrawing from communities. And I think if one looks not just at happiness, but also purpose, character, relationships, I think the effects are negative. I mean, I think that's some of what we're finding when we're comparing meaning and purpose in richer developed countries to poorer developing countries. So there's real costs. I mean, what we're seeing in the United States right now is a dramatic increase in mental health problems. And I think some of it, not the whole story, but I do think some of it is a withdrawing from those communities. But I do think it is an important question, one that merits further examination. And maybe this relates to one of the earlier questions on how people weight these domains. But I think it may also be the case that if people understood the contribution of these communities to their lives over time, they might make decisions differently. I think some of what's going on are trade-offs, real trade-offs between short-term well-being and happiness and long-term well-being happiness. And I'm not sure we're always making the decisions in the best way possible in that regard. These cite real-world examples where flourishing research has changed public policy. I think there's a lot more room for it to do so. I think we will see more examples in the next decades. I think interest in this has really increased over time, but I mean, some examples are New Zealand now focusing on well-being outcomes in making policy decisions. This was a fairly recent commitment. Bhutan likewise looks at a global happiness gross happiness product and has this lens in decision making. They made decisions about establishing new mines based not on economic considerations, but what they thought this was going to do to the country's happiness. Some of the work on well-being in the United Kingdom was what led to the establishing of a new minister for loneliness. And then I think this has happened at more local levels as well. Santa Monica has embraced a well-being agenda in California for city decision making and has tried to make decisions about zoning and parks and so on not on economic grounds, but on what enhances well-being. So there are a handful of more isolated examples. I think before we see more, we need to start measuring. I really do think what we measure shapes what we discuss and policy. So I think we need to start tracking. Another comment, I hope someday nations would report Human Flourishing Index alongside GDP per capita. That is certainly my hope as well. Again, I think GDP is important, but it's just one measure, and it's not everything. It doesn't encompass everything people care about. Maybe family need not to be equaled with marriage, since other family members can be a crucial part of filial piety, for instance. I think that's right. I think most of the research on this topic of family has focused principally on marriage, and again, most of it has been shaped by Western research context. But I think the importance of extended family and of the contributions, not just of parents to children, but over time, later in life, of children to parents, really is quite critical and needs further study. So I in that figure, I put family as the as the pathway rather than marriage, even though most of the rigorous empirical research has been on marriage. I really do think it's family as a whole. And maybe stay in another minute or two if there are any further questions you want to express orally. Just raise your hand.
Yeah, I think you have asked a lot of questions in the chat box. They didn't raise any hand, and nobody raised a hand to unmute themselves. Wow. That's really cool work. I couldn't wait to see what kind of new information you can generate after you collect more data from these global studies. That's really wonderful job. It's a really interesting talk. So if the participants, if you don't have any more questions, then we will finish today's public lecture. And we want to thank Professor VanderWeele to deliver this wonderful talk to us. Thank you so much. And thank you all for participating in the workshop.
Thank you all. It's really been a pleasure being here, and wish you all the best. Hope you enjoy the conference, and may you flourish in life. But thank you all again.
Yes, great. Everybody should enjoy.